Well, we will, of course, hear from the federal government in the form of a speech from the throne, and it is expected to lay out a three-pronged approach, tackling COVID-19, offering supports to Canadians who are suffering from the effects of the pandemic, and then framing a resiliency agenda for the overall economy. What might some of that look like, and how big might the spending be? And more importantly, what do CEOs across this country and those who are managing money need to see? Mark Wiseman is the incoming head of the Alberta Investment Management Company, a former CEO, of course, of the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board. Mark, great to have you with us. And let's start right there. I mean, there's obviously there are a lot of kind of strands to this, but big picture, what are you hoping to hear from the government tomorrow that hasn't been telegraphed? And what do you think this speech from the throne needs to accomplish?
Well, thanks, Amanda, and great to be with you again today. Look, this is a very important, perhaps the most important speech from the throne that we've heard in decades. And what the government has to lay out for Canadians, I believe, is that road to recovery. We aren't, by any stretch of the imagination, through the pandemic, but we will be through the pandemic. And we have to start thinking about how are we going to generate long-term growth in the Canadian economy in order to pay for what we've had to spend fighting the pandemic. I like to think about it a little bit. You know, we've been in the emergency room, and now we have to think about what is the rehabilitation program going to look like? What is the country's physiotherapy and occupational therapy for our economy going to look like going forward?
You know, the easiest job to save is the one that already exists. And so it raises the question, of course, of when you talk about restarting the economy and at the same time think about jobs of the future, which you hear about, or the greening of the economy. Can you do both? Do you feel as though that's a very tall order in the middle of a crisis of this scale?
Well, it is a tall order, but we're not in an easy position, and we have to challenge ourselves to take that on. Where we are today, Amanda, is the government has essentially borrowed $10,000 to date for each man, woman, and child in this country. That has to be paid back. Thought about another way, we've essentially, the government has spent so far this year $2 for every dollar that it has brought in terms of revenue. Now, that's been the right thing to do, and I've advocated that spending. I've said the government is doing the right thing by throwing everything at this pandemic to keep the economic heart beating of the country, to keep the heart of business beating, and to ensure that Canadians are protected, the most vulnerable are protected through this crisis. However, we have to start thinking differently as hopefully we begin to see later this year and early next year a light at the end of the pandemic tunnel. And in order to do that, what we really need to start thinking about is that the money that we spend, every dollar now matters. And every dollar matters not just in terms of protecting the most vulnerable, but thinking about how that dollar is going to generate sufficient growth going forward to pay for all of that borrowing. We have to be able to pay back those billions, in fact, hundreds of billions of dollars that, again, we've quite rightly utilized and will continue to utilize. But we have to generate enough growth or we're going to cripple a generation of Canadians having to pay it back. And that means moving our pre-COVID growth trajectory from somewhere closer to 2% up to 3% un-COVID affected. And that's a big, big task ahead of us.
It is definitely a big task, and it gets straight to task force that you've been part of that recommended higher immigration targets. We know immigration has had a majorly beneficial impact on our economy last year. It is not going to have that impact this year. It's just not going to exist. Do you expect to hear something bold from the government on that front? Is there anything we can do about that amidst a global pandemic?
Well, yes, and we should push our advantage. As it relates to immigration, we have to invest in this country, in my view, both on physical capital. So we have to think about areas like infrastructure. We have to get those shovels in the ground quickly. We have to think about getting our natural resources to market. We have to think about building resiliency in our supply chains. We have to double down on technology. And then, as you rightly said, we also have to think about the human capital side of the equation. In fact, I believe that the vast majority of growth that we've had in Canada since the Second World War has come from the fact that we have brought new Canadians into our economy. Those Canadians pay taxes, those Canadians start businesses, those Canadians are entrepreneurial, and those Canadians are consumers, those new Canadians. I would advocate that we quickly do what Canadians do best. I mean, let's double down on the things that we do really well. And one of the things we do very well in this country is bring and integrate new people. And so I would personally advocate increasing our current immigration levels to somewhere closer to 500,000 a year from about 330,000 that was currently coming into the country pre-COVID. And I would use our advantage to grow our economy by targeting immigrants, quite frankly, skilled immigrants in many cases, who would otherwise be going to the United States and who don't want to go there or can't go there today. We should be encouraging those people to come north of the border and to help us grow our economy. Keep in mind, these are consumers, these are taxpayers, these are entrepreneurs. Right. These are people who are going to help us grow. And if we think short term, of course, it's easy to say we've got, high unemployment today. We didn't have high unemployment coming into COVID, but we have to be thinking forward in order to start that ball rolling today if we're going to try and drive recovery and, frankly, pay back those hundreds of billions of dollars. That's got to be part of the growth plan.
Well, and then I do want to just talk, before I let you go, talk to you about that, because the growth, obviously, to your point, is going to be critical. Growing at 3% is, unusual for the Canadian economy in normal times. So that's a kind of a stimulative growth. Meanwhile, we're looking for some kind of restraint from government. We're not likely to grow our way out of the massive deficits we have. Do you worry that either it'll be ignored or that it'll be pushed out to be somebody else's problem?
Well, look, I don't think we have a choice, Amanda, except to grow our way out of it. And, I'm a believer generally in normal times, the government isn't necessarily the best allocator of capital. The growth ultimately will come from the private sector. But given where we are today, given that the government has to spend in the current circumstances, given that it has spent, quite rightly, in the current circumstances, we have to make sure that that spending stimulates growth. And again, it's growth in both human capital and in sort of physical capital that's critically important. And it's got to be growth that ultimately catalyzes private sector investment and catalyzes private sector GDP formation. I think we can do that, and I think we can do that in a green way. So to me, it's not a choice between a climate agenda and a growth agenda. I don't think a green growth in and of itself is a recovery plan, but everything we do can be done through a green lens. But again, we have to start thinking that every dollar has to have a multiplier effect going forward. If it doesn't have that multiplier effect, it's going to be your children, speaking figuratively, and everybody else's children and grandchildren, frankly, they're going to be paying for that. And that can't be the right answer. So the only way out of this, ignoring it isn't, we won't be able to ignore it. Financial markets won't allow us to ignore it. So the only way out of this is to have a strong growth agenda and making sure we're getting that multiplier effect.
Mark, it's great to have your thoughts on this. Really appreciate it.